Now, at this point, we're going to add an about page to our applications, so that we'll have 3 static pages: home, contact, and about. And you could probably guess, based on the models provided by the home page and the contact page, how to do that. But partially because it's a relatively simple exercise, we're going to take this as an opportunity to introduce one of the most important subjects in Rails web development, namely automated testing. And in particular, we're going to be using a technique called test-driven development. Now, I should say that when I first heard about test-driven development, I thought it was crazy. It involves writing the test before writing the application code. And I thought that this would never work, but it does work, and I now think it's a great way to develop software. So what we're going to do is first write a test for the presence of an about page. And then we're going to see that test fail, and then we'll add the about page and get the test to pass. So our first step is kind of an annoying one. The first step is to remove some files that get generated automatically. I'm going to do git rm-r for recursive, and I'm going to remove the spec views directory because I don't like the view specs. I also don't like the specs for the helpers. I tend to test my helpers and views in the controller test, so that's the approach that the Ruby on Rails tutorial takes. I should mention, though, that every individual Rails programmer has his or her own way of doing tests, and I'm sure mine will continue to evolve. But everyone agrees that it doesn't matter all that much how you test as long as you test. And at this point, we're actually ready to run the test suite. So let's just take a look at this .spec directory that I just updated. You can now see that there's a spec helper file that defines some things rspec needs to run. And then you can see in the controllers that there's a pages controller spec. So let's see what happens when we run this thing. We can actually just run the whole spec directory, even though there's only one file. This is a good practice. There's a command line command called rspec. You might think that's an obvious name, but it used to be called just spec. But new in rspec 2, it's called rspec. Now rspec spec will run our test suite. Now you might notice we're having to wait a little bit right here, and I'll mention in a minute how we can speed that up. But this is great. We're now green. This is the word that people use to describe a passing test suite. I think probably because green means go, but you can see that it's literally green in this case too. rspec is configured to show the output in green, and we'll see momentarily that a failing test suite is called red. So the usual cycle in test-driven development is going from red to green. I drew your attention to that little bit of overhead at the beginning when we first ran rspec spec. That overhead is what's needed to load all of the Rails environments and just get everything loaded into memory, and then rspec can run. Because that overhead is reasonably long, I'm going to use a program called Spork in order to speed things up. You can look at the supplementary screencast on setting up an OS X testing environment that shows you how to configure your system to run like my system, but it only works on OS X, and it's very specific to the way I work. So you don't necessarily have to look at that, but for this tutorial, we're going to use the techniques that I've become accustomed to, and in particular, Spork will help speed things up considerably, so it'll be a better viewing experience for you too. So I'm going to open up a new tab, and at this point, I'm going to run Spork in this new tab. So you can see it using rspec loading spork.prefork block. Now, this will not work for you unless you've followed the specific set of instructions in the supplementary screencast, and probably like after having Googled some error messages. But this will work on my system for now, and it's really great because you can see rspec spec, and it runs right away. The overhead is diminished dramatically. Now there's one more thing I want to introduce, which is auto-test. This is my preferred way of developing Rails applications. So I actually like to have standard tab locations. This is the server, and I like to have Spork in the third tab, and then auto-test in the second tab. And then I reserve the first tab for issuing command. So let's cd to the directory. And now I'm going to run auto-test. And I want you to keep an eye on the bottom left of the screen. Here we go. So I've got my auto test configured to issue what's called a growl notification that has information about what the application test suite has done. In this case, 2 examples passed, and you can see it's green down here too. So that's really nice because sometimes you won't necessarily have this auto test window showing, and it's nice to have a visual indication of what's happening in the application. Okay, with that setup complete, now we're ready to get to red. We're going to write a failing test for the presence of an about page. So let's do that. The first thing to do is to take a look at the actual spec that's being run right now, which is in spec controllers pages controller spec. So this is our first look at our spec. Believe it or not, this is pure Ruby. If you've studied Ruby before, this may still not look familiar. The reason is because our spec exploits the malleability of Ruby in order to make a domain-specific language, or DSL, for writing tests. So you can see here that our spec is quite descriptive. It is designed to read more or less like natural language. Here we have describe pages controller, and then get home. This is the HTTP request. It says if you get the home action, it should be successful, and then there's some actual code in here. Now this stuff here, this stuff in green string, these are strings. These can be anything. But this here, this get, is not a string. This is an actual function that, in the context of a test, issues a get request to the home action. In this case, the response should be success. This is the way our spec works. It's response.should be _ success. In this case, success refers to the kind of response code that you get when you hit a page and get back an indication from the server that the page actually exists, and then that the request was successful. And you can see that there's a similar test for the contact page. Now, one of the nice things about generating a little bit of code, in this case with Rails generate controller, is that we get something to start with. This is quite a lot of code, and it may be quite new to you, but you can get a handle on how you might write a test for an about page just by looking at the example.